course, you're still under oath.
Yes.
And Ms. Andrews, you may proceed.
Thank you. Good afternoon, or morning actually now. I believe we left off on Thursday talking about Tennessee. So let me ask you about Jolene Hare. You contacted Jolene Hare, who lives in Tennessee.
Yes.
She's a friend of yours.
Yes.
And in fact, Jolene Hare is the person who provided you the phone number for Janet Morris.
Yes.
And you also asked Jolene Hare to find Elizabeth a job in Tennessee.
No.
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 Okay, and you asked Jolene Hare to provide her employment at Able-Bodied Colonics?
No.
And
I don't believe she even owned Able-Bodied Colonics. I don't know if she did back then. I don't remember if she owned it yet.
But she owns a place called Able-Bodied Colonics?
I know she does now. I'm not sure when she opened, but no, she would have to go through training, get certified, and all that stuff. So,
okay. So if Jolene Hare told the police back in 2010 about the phone calls that you made to her,
Objection, Your Honor, calls for hearsay.
Actually, overruled. It doesn't call for hearsay. You can ask the question.
and about owning Able-Bodied Colonics, that's not true.
If she owned Able-Bodied Colonics, or if I wanted her to give Elizabeth a job?
Both.
If she said to the police that she owned Able-Bodied Colonics, could be true. Not sure when, what year, or what date she opened. But as far as getting somebody a job, never.
Okay. And so then you also didn't ask Jolene Hare to assist in finding Elizabeth somewhere to stay in Tennessee?
No, why would we? We had a house. Why would we ask her?
And you didn't ask Jolene Hare to help Elizabeth with baby items?
No.
We heard a lot of testimony, a lot of statements from you with the detective about comments that Elizabeth told you about Logan McQueary.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about all the things that Elizabeth told you, and you said she backed them up with WIC records, with Logan's criminal history, with his shot records, and was there one more thing?
The letter, yeah, it was the letter from the place that she goes to get her parenting classes and stuff.
And so you talked a lot about things that Elizabeth Johnson said about Logan McQueary.
Okay.
And then you talked to the detectives later on about the fact that you talked to Logan McQueary several times between December 21st and December 22nd, 2009.
That is correct.
On those 2 days, you had maybe a couple of hours of phone calls with Logan McQueary?
About 2.5 hours total in those 2 days.
Between those 2 days. And those are corroborated by the phone records that you talked to Logan about 2.5 hours for 2 days.
Yes.
And we've heard some of those phone calls here in this trial. Your attorneys played them for the jury.
I think there's a couple that have been entered in.
Right. And some we haven't heard yet.
I guess so, because we haven't heard them.
You haven't heard a couple of the phone calls?
We've never heard them.
But it seems that you and Logan were in agreement of generally what took place in those phone calls.
I'm sorry. Help me to understand the exact question you're asking. That way I can be clear as to the answer. Can you be a little more specific as to what you're saying?
Generally, for the most part, do you agree with what Logan said about what happened in those phone calls on the 21st and the 22nd?
Some pieces that he says and some pieces no.
Right. And one of the things you disagree with Logan on is whether or not he told you that he and his dad were thinking about adoption.
I don't think he said that when he testified, but if he didn't say that, then I wouldn't agree. So if he didn't say that, then I wouldn't agree with him since he didn't say that.
Fair enough. But your testimony is that you and he talked about whether or not he was up in the air about adoption.
Yes.
And you were present when Frank McQueary testified.
Yes.
And Frank McQueary said that Logan was never up in the air on adoption.
I don't remember what Frank said, but if you say that, then whatever he said, I don't know what he said.
Okay. And you're stating that's not exactly what Logan told you on the phone.
That's nothing like what Logan told me on the phone on the 22nd.
And then you made comments to the detective that you thought maybe he was just saying that to you.
I remember when I think the detectives first came to our house maybe around the 26th. Do you know if that's correct?
The 29th is what the date that I have the first
The
time.
29th? Okay.
Or do you mean Detective Aguilera on the 27th with Duarte?
Whatever detective I might have told that to was around between the 26th, 29th, somewhere in that area. And then Logan and I spoke the 21st and 22nd. And it went from, on the 21st, it was one thing. 22nd, he woke up and he had talked to his dad. They stayed up all night long, he said, deciding that they wanted us to adopt the baby and they wanted to meet with us and get to know us.
Okay, well, listen to my question. My question is, do you recall telling the detective that maybe Logan was just saying that to you and didn't really mean that?
When they finally came to my house around the 26th to the 29th, I started to feel, because the detectives are telling me, no, he didn't want the baby adopted out. And so, of course, I'm thinking, well, maybe he said that. Maybe he's saying that because for some other reason. Maybe he's just trying to figure out what we know. Maybe he's played us or something.
So that appears to be the only disagreement you and Logan have about those conversations between the 21st and the 22nd.
Not that there's a lot of disagreement. There's a lot of things that weren't said that Logan said. And I don't remember every single bit of his testimony, and I haven't really thought about it this past week or two. If I sat and really thought or maybe reread it or something, I might find more discrepancies in there. I know that he tried to say, at first he tried to say that we didn't give him the phone number on the 22nd, and then he finally said that we did, you know. And so, of course, there I definitely would disagree.
You believe he testified to that?
I remember him kind of dancing around the fact that I believe he first said it was the 26th when we gave him the phone number. And then I think when my attorney asked him, he finally said it was the 22nd.
So those are the two discrepancies you have between what Logan said and what you said about those phone calls.
That bothered me, that I could remember, yes, that bothered me.
But for the most part in those phone calls, you and Logan talked a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a yes?
Yes.
And in those conversations, Logan told you a lot about Elizabeth.
The first day, I think he talked a lot about Elizabeth, and not much on the second day. He told me a whole lot about himself on the second day, wanted to know more about us, and then we talked about how the adoption and all that kind of stuff. So the first day, on the 21st, he talked about Elizabeth.
So on the first day, Logan told you a lot about Elizabeth.
A little bit, not a lot, but a little.
And in fact, he told you about the criminal damage she had committed.
Yes.
And he had told you about the claim of kidnapping.
I think so.
And he had told you about not knowing anything about adoption until she showed up at his work that day and claimed he had kidnapped Gabriel.
I'm not positive if he said that, but he could have.
And he talked to you about some of Elizabeth Johnson's behavior in regard to Gabriel,
yes.
Her relationship with Gabriel.
Yes.
And he talked to you about some of the things that they had argued about and things that they had said.
I don't know about that part.
After these two phone calls on the 21st and the 22nd, based on your own testimony, you said you started to bond with Logan.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a yes?
Yes, on the first day I did, yes.
You started to bond with Logan. And in fact, you were learning things about Elizabeth that you said you never knew before.
Yes.
And then the detectives started coming to your home on December 27th.
Around there, I think.
The day that Elizabeth said she killed Gabriel, the detectives showed up at your home.
Yes.
And they also talked to you on the phone before they showed up at your home.
I don't remember if they did.
Okay. Do you recall Officer Snell testifying that he called you when Logan was there at the police station and talked to you for some time on the telephone?
Yes.
Okay. And then Detective Ramirez also talked to you before she came, before the other detectives were at your house.
I'm sure they did, but I don't remember 2.5 years ago somebody calling me before they came. I do remember, though, Detective Aguilera calling at around midnight before he came that very first time, the very day that we got the baby. I do remember that phone call.
Okay, but I'm talking about from the 27th on. That was December 9th.
Yeah, there was so many phone calls and people in and out, so much traffic in and out. I don't know who called when or what, you know.
You had many conversations with the police.
Many. I mean, I'm worried about that this baby might be dead. So
I'm talking about conversations you had with the police after December 21st and December 22nd when you talked to Logan.
So what is the question, though?
My question is, do you recall talking to police after December 21st and December 22nd?
I thought I answered that. Yes, many times.
Okay.
Many
and
times.
on those occasions, you talked to the police specifically about Logan.
I probably did.
In fact, you told them about his criminal history.
Yes.
You told the police that he was threatening Elizabeth.
Yes.
You told the police that Logan is the one who told Elizabeth that she was facing kidnapping charges.
I probably did because that's what she was telling me that her grandfather kept telling her, and I know he told me. I probably did tell them that because that's what I believed.
Okay. So you told the police that Logan was the one who told Elizabeth that she was facing kidnapping charges.
Probably so.
Okay.
Yes.
And you have referred to Logan as a liar based on what he put in the petition for custody.
Did I say that? I'm sorry.
Well, I believe, and the jurors can decide on their own, but I believe you said that Logan was lying and you knew he was lying because of the records Elizabeth showed you.
I don't remember when I said that. Can you just remind me, kind of refresh my memory so I know where you're...
It was during the trial when you testified.
Okay, so the other day I said Logan was lying.
You testified that you knew Logan was lying on the paperwork he filed with court because of the paperwork Elizabeth Johnson had showed you.
Okay, now I understand what you're talking about. So the paperwork, I'm a more visual person. So the paperwork that he filed, yes, there were a bunch of lies on there. She had showed me the paperwork. There was a bunch of lies that he wrote on there, and I could give you those.
Your claim is that Logan was lying on that paperwork and you told the detectives that.
Yes.
Now, you talked a lot about the media attention in this case, and there was a lot of media attention in this case, correct?
Yes.
And you appeared on the media several times.
Yes.
You did interviews several times with the Nancy Grace Show.
Yes.
And that's a nationally televised program.
I guess so. I don't watch it, but I think it might be.
You don't watch the Nancy Grace Show?
No.
You did some other interviews on television as well?
Yes.
And it was your statement that the reason you did this is because nobody else would talk to the media and you wanted to help find Gabriel.
That is what the media told us.
And in fact, how many times did you appear on the Nancy Grace Show?
I have no clue. We were running on anxiety and no sleep, trying to help find a baby.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. Would you disagree with me if I told you that you were aired, and I say aired because I don't know if this means you actually went to the station and talked to them this many times, but you aired on January 5th, 2010? Does that sound correct?
Honestly, I don't know the dates. We had severe anxiety and no sleep during many, many weeks during the beginning of this, trying to help everyone we could to find this baby.
Well, let me ask you this. Does it sound right that you appeared many times between January 5th, 2010 and January 20th, 2010?
I don't want to say yes because I really don't know what dates that we actually went there. Now, whether they aired it later, I don't know. I really think that the dates would have been more closer, like within that first couple weeks of this happening. Okay. So honestly, I don't know. I remember it being, if you could give me the date that I went down in the basement that day with Detective Ramirez, I believe that was the very last time that we ever were on like the Nancy Grace Show.
January 14th, 2010?
If that was the date, then that probably would have been the last time, or else it was like a day or two before that date.
Well, let me ask you this. Are you aware the Nancy Grace Show provided transcripts from their show regarding this case?
I would assume all of the media outlets would have provided all their transcripts.
Well, I didn't ask about the other media outlets. I asked about the Nancy Grace show.
Well,
Were
no,
you
I just
aware?
assumed they all did.
Wait for the question before
Give the answer. Go
Were
ahead.
you aware the Nancy Grace show provided transcripts from your appearances on their show?
I guess that would be a yes. I assumed that everybody would.
Have
so.
you seen them?
I don't know.
Now, they were provided to us as well as the defense some time ago, but you don't recall if you've ever seen them.
I mean, we've got boxes full of stuff. I didn't read everything.
Now, it's your statement that you were on the television shows in order to help find Gabriel.
Yes.
Yet you found it necessary to go on national television and talk about Logan's criminal history.
They said in order to get this baby's face on air, in order to find a baby, you have to have the baby's face, right? And so the more
Okay, but
times that baby's face
I
is
didn't
on
ask
there.
you about the baby's face.
Okay.
Let the witness answer the question.
Well, the witness has to answer the question asked, and she was not answering the question as asked, so I'm going to direct you to answer the question that was asked. So the objection's overruled. Restate the question.
My question was, you felt it necessary to go on national television and talk about Logan's criminal history.
I went on there to find the baby, yes, to tell the truth. They want the truth to find the baby.
And televising on national television Logan's criminal history was going to help find Gabriel.
Yes, because it would get his face out there once again.
They couldn't put his face out because he was missing?
No, they said that they can't do that.
Well, they told you had to talk about Logan's criminal history.
They probably just asked about it. I don't think, did I bring it up? I mean, just on a whim? Or typically we're asked questions and we just answer the questions just like you're doing.
Not only did you talk on national television about Logan's criminal history, you also talked about the fact that he was threatening Elizabeth Johnson.
I don't know, but if something like that was asked, then I answered it correctly to the best of my knowledge and as truthful as I could be.
And in fact, you didn't say she said he was threatening her. You said he was threatening her.
If I did, it's because I know he was threatening me to her, telling me to tell her things,
Oh, so now Logan
So
was
I
threatening you
believed her.
to threaten Elizabeth.
telling me to tell her these things, telling her just like he wrote in the text message to me. He was telling me, you tell her if she doesn't get back here right now, there's going to be a warrant issued for her arrest and blah, and he goes on, and he keeps telling me this stuff on the 21st and then at the end of the 22nd.
So it's your testimony that there's a text message from Logan to you that says you tell her if she doesn't come back, there's going to be a warrant for her arrest?
I don't know if that's exactly what it says, but that was what I was told
So
to
that's
me
not it.
verbally. But yeah, something very similar to that.
All right, let me ask you this then. Do you recall being asked on the Nancy Grace show about a MySpace page where you stated that Elizabeth Johnson had gone underground?
I don't know. I don't remember, no.
Well, here, I'll show it to you. I'm sorry, Your Honor. May I approach? I apologize. You go ahead and read there. All the way to there.
Okay.
And you can actually just read that yourself, see if it refreshes your recollection.
Okay. Is it Caesar? Is that his name?
If you just
whoever's-
want to look at that to yourself and see if it refreshes
don't
your
read it out
recollection.
loud? You don't, I'm sorry.
If you want to just read that to yourself
Okay.
and see if it refreshes your recollection,
Okay.
and then I'll ask you about it again.
Okay, I'm remembering.
Madam Mayor, question.
I'm remembering the conversation. I didn't read it all, but I do kind of remember that conversation.
You didn't read the whole part that I had highlighted?
I thought you wanted me to just refresh my memory. You want me to read the whole
refresh
thing?
your memory.
It refreshes my memory, yes, once I started to read the parts that I was saying.
Now, you recall having a conversation on the Nancy Grace show about a MySpace post that you put about Elizabeth Johnson going underground.
Yes, somebody had asked me about that, and I answered.
And in fact, you stated that you put in the word underground because you believed Elizabeth Johnson had gone to a domestic violence shelter.
I'm sorry, I didn't read that far. I guess I should have.
Do you recall that?
Do I recall saying that?
Yes.
That's what she was telling me around that time frame.
That's not what I asked you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I asked if you recall
Do I recall
saying on the
saying
Nancy Grace show.
I don't know. I don't really remember every single
Show you again.
bit of what I've said. Even if I read it, I still probably would not know if I actually said it.
All the way down to there.
Okay. Okay.
Do you recall now saying on the Nancy Grace show that you put that on there because Elizabeth Johnson, you thought she had gone to a domestic violence shelter?
I mean, it says that I'm saying all that stuff. A lot of, like I said, we were running on no sleep and anxiety. So if it says I said it, I'm sure I said it. That's what we were informed around the time of the 22nd when we were first getting in touch with Elizabeth at that first time, because we had given Logan her number. So she was going to run away to a domestic violence shelter and she didn't trust us anymore.
And in fact, didn't you say on national television that you used the word underground because you didn't want to say domestic violence?
I think I remember saying that.
And do you recall saying, I didn't want that to make Logan think that I was trying to say he was violent towards her because as far as I know, he was not?
Yeah, as far as I know, he was not violent towards her.
On the day you went to the courthouse with Elizabeth Johnson, December 14th, 2009, you talked a lot about that day, said it was very hectic.
Yes.
You, in fact, talked to Craig Cherry that morning on your telephone, didn't you?
It shows that on my records. I did, yes.
I have no further questions.
Thank you. Redirect, Mr. Lee.
Tammi, what changed your mind about Logan McQueary?
The first day, he talked pretty bad about Elizabeth, kind of like Elizabeth did to him.
Okay.
When I got to know Elizabeth. So he talked pretty bad about her. And I'm starting to believe him and then disbelieve Elizabeth. So, I'm kind of flip-flopping my opinions here. And then on the 22nd, when I talked to him on the 22nd, all of a sudden, he starts telling me, what I had told you already about the fact that him and his dad stayed up all night long. They want us to adopt the baby and wanting to know, everything about it. Like, do I pay you child support? How much is child support? Do I have an attorney? All these different things. So he's really getting into that conversation. And finally, we get a hold of Elizabeth because he tells us how to get a hold of her. She calls us back. We give him the phone number. There's maybe one more conversation, two more, somewhere in there afterwards that we talk. And immediately after the back and forth between you tell her this, you tell him this, you tell her this. I mean, there's one time on here you'll see where we literally talked for 3 minutes with both of them at the very same time,
Now, Tammi,
telling each other.
As this went on, did the police talk to you about what was going on?
Did the police talk to me
Did
about
they talk to you about Logan?
our conversations? They didn't want to know about it.
Okay.
No.
We heard on the tapes where you said to Elizabeth on the confrontation call that this baby was Logan's child and that you were never going to be able to adopt that child. Do you remember that?
On the confrontation call
Yes,
from Detective Ramirez.
Yes. When Elizabeth called you.
Oh, right. Okay. Yes.
Okay. Now, it seemed like your position towards Logan had changed at that point.
At that point, yeah.
Why had it changed?
It had changed a few times. And then at that time, with the confrontation call, because what she did, to do what she did, I mean, you know, running to San Antonio and then she gets a hold of us and we start talking to her, that's one thing. We're trying to get her back. We're thinking we can get her back here, right? But then she cuts ties and says that she killed the baby. At that point, now I don't know who to believe, because I've been fed stories from both parents, and I find that both of them are lying to me in many different ways. But the fact that she said she did that to the baby, to me, is not. I mean, I forgive anybody, but that's unforgivable in my book. As far as, you know, I could never be a friend or help somebody who would say something like that. You know.
Okay. Why did you go on the media?
Because we were told by all the media outlets that we cannot just put a baby's face. I mean, there's thousands and thousands of babies missing. There would be no news. So the only way to get on there is if they have somebody to sit there and ask them questions and give them new news, fresh news every day. So we could have been on there every single day had it not been for the detective, you know, to kind of cut us off at the knees and not want us on there. So we were hoping that Gabriel would be found, just like the media told us. Let's keep putting him up there and putting him up there, putting him up there, and eventually somebody somewhere is going to recognize him. You know, so we did all that we could until the police basically did what they did to us.
Tammi, how many times do you think you talked to the police?
To the police and detectives, like everyone all
anybody
combined?
from law enforcement.
Are you combining telephone?
Just telephone, anybody. Was it a lot?
I would guess maybe 30 times or more.
Okay. Did you allow them into your home?
All the time, anytime.
Did you allow them access to anything in your home that they wanted?
Yes, matter of fact, I told them I would sign anything. They can go through my computers, whatever they want to go through, and they can take whatever they want the very first day.
Why did you do that?
Because I wanted them to, a couple things. I wanted them to find Gabriel. I wanted them to go through my stuff and find out, was there anything that I might be missing that I could have said, you know, that could lead them to something else that somebody else could have said. You know what I mean? And then thirdly, they were asking us questions that almost sounded like we might have had something to do with it. So I wanted them to take it immediately and know that we have nothing to do with this baby leaving or anything, you know.
Tammi, you talked on, you were asked questions about your businesses and your house and your lifestyle. What has this case done to your life?
I mean, Jack was very modest.
I believe this goes beyond the scope of crops.
It does not.
It's close, but I don't believe it does go beyond the scope. Overruled. You can answer the question.
I think Jack was very modest in what he said, because he's a man. I've worked very, very hard to build my company, gone to school over and over. It took me a good 6 years to become who I am, a advanced certified colon therapist, as well as a colon therapy instructor, to train others, to help others, you know. And they not only, what was done to me was been put all over the internet just because we were helping, going on TV to help find a baby. Because of that, it opened the door to us and allowed people to say anything they want about us. People involved. There's people that go on the internet and say ugly things about us, and our business is ran strictly by the internet. And so we have Google ads out there that are saying that we kidnap babies and, you know, and just horrible things like that. So of course we've lost our home, and I actually had to sell my Mercedes in order to pay the house note at my home. But of course, on the internet, they say that I sold it because I'm paying somebody to hide Gabriel somewhere. And it's, those little things right there is just what has destroyed our life and our company. But the fact that we're Christians, we have each other and we have our family, and that's what's important. So we can build our life again, and we will. We will.
How many locations do you now have?
We're down to one, and we're barely struggling to pay our rent.
How many did you have before this started?
We had 5, and then I had my home location, which was where I trained people and where I did all my pro bono work for sick people that couldn't afford it.
What happened to the house that we've heard about?
Our beautiful home that we built,
Yes.
it's in foreclosure. It's gone.
Okay.
So there's no getting it back. It's done. I believe it's going to be sold in a couple days, or a week or so.
Has it caused stress on the family?
Absolutely it has.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you. Before Ms. Smith steps down, does the jury have any questions for her? Going once, going twice. We do. Hang on, don't go anywhere yet. Would counsel please approach? Thank you. Got a question from the jury. I'm asking it, but they're really asking it, so give them the answer. Before you gave the handwriting sample, were you shown the document in which you wrote Craig Cherry's name?
That was for you, right? Okay.
No, answer.
Oh, to anybody?
Answer to the entire jury.
Okay.
You don't answer to an individual person, just
Okay.
answer to the jury.
No, I was not. I didn't know what I was there for. I was asked to write out a check, basically a fake check, so I didn't know what they meant by that. I assumed they thought that I was giving her money or something and wrote out checks or something, so I didn't know what it meant.
Okay, follow up. Mr. Lee?
No.
Any follow-ups, Andrews?
No, Your Honor.
Any other questions from the jury before we let Ms. Smith step down? All right, you may be excused. Watch your step going down. And the defense may call its next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Defense will call Kenneth Schutt, and I told him 11:30, so I will see if he's here. Hopefully he is. Thank you. My apologies to the court. Mr. Schutt is not here yet. As I indicated, I instructed Mr. Schutt to be here at 11:30.
Okay, so we're going to take a quick break so you don't have to sit around and wait. We expect to get going in about 15 minutes, so we'll be back at 11:30. Until then, remember the admonition, and we'll see you in 15 minutes.
All right.
Okay, please be seated, everyone. We are outside the presence of the jury. That's what Mr. Schutt gets for being on time. While we're waiting, and I wanted to raise this before, so this gives me the opportunity to raise the issue now. Are we going to have any issue relating to privilege? Mr. Schutt obviously is an attorney. He apparently was Ms. Smith's attorney. Are we going to have any possibility of there being an assertion of a privilege here?
I don't believe so, Your Honor. That was a matter that was discussed between Mr. Schutt and Ms. Smith, and my understanding is that they have resolved it between each other, and Mr. Schutt, I don't think, is anticipating any issue with that, and neither am I.
All right. Okay, and then I take it that you're not going to have any other witnesses after Mr. Schutt? Is that
That's correct, Your Honor. We will rest after Mr. Schutt.
Okay. Do we have a rebuttal case?
Your Honor, we do intend to recall Detective Ramirez for a short period of time.
Okay, and that's it, just Detective Ramirez?
Yes.
Okay. So I think we'll clearly finish early this afternoon, and then we'll talk about where that leaves us, and we'll, as anticipated, close tomorrow. So we'll wait for Mr. Schutt to get here. Well, we'll now wait till 11:30 because I told the jury. So hopefully he'll be here at 11:30. When he's here, we'll get going.
And Your Honor, I don't know how long Mr. Schutt will take, but if for some reason he takes a shorter amount of time, we'd ask to put the rebuttal on after the lunch break.
I will allow you to do that.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right? All right, I'll see you in a few minutes. When you're ready.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. Good morning, Ken.
Good morning.
Please introduce yourself to our jury.
My name's Ken Schutt.
And Ken, what do you do for a living?
I'm an attorney.
How long have you been an attorney?
Almost 30 years,
And is that all here in Arizona?
all with the exception of 8 months. I moved back to Nebraska, which is where I grew up, and I went back for 8 months and then decided I wanted to come back to Arizona before the winter hit.
Understood. I'm going to ask you to speak up just a little bit, okay? This is a really large room.
Okay.
Okay, great, thank you. And during the 30 years that you've practiced here in Arizona, what type of law have you practiced?
Basically, general civil practice. I do a lot of commercial litigation, landlord-tenant work. I've had the opportunity to do some adoptions. I've done one divorce. Mostly civil work. I don't do any criminal work at all.
Okay. Do you have any special education or training in doing adoption law?
I've handled just a few adoptions in my career, and I've had one seminar that I've attended that was sponsored by the Arizona State Bar.
Okay. Are you currently doing adoptions?
Not regularly.
And you stated that you have done 3, correct? You have done 3 adoptions.
I have, correct.
And were they contested or uncontested?
They were all uncontested.
And can you briefly explain the difference between a contested and uncontested adoption for our jury, please?
An uncontested adoption is just one where the parents both agree that they want to give the child up for adoption. A contested adoption would be where either one of the parents does not agree, and it's going to become a battle of some kind, or there could be some other party that objects to the adoption. So if it's anybody objects to the adoption at all, it's going to be a contested adoption.
Do you know Jack and Tammi Smith?
I do.
Where did you meet them?
I first met them when they were referred to me by our church as someone that was looking for an adoption attorney. I get a lot of referrals from our church for people that have a lot of different legal matters. Either I will handle the matter if I'm capable of doing so, or I will refer them out to someone else.
Do you remember when you met them?
It was in December of 2009.
Did they hire you to do an adoption for them?
They did.
And do you remember when that was?
It was early in December of 2009.
Okay. Did you have any conversations with them about the adoption process in general at that point?
Yeah, I'm sure I did. I would have explained to them how the process worked. I would have explained to them that I only handle uncontested adoptions, so that everybody had to be on board. I would simply do the paperwork, and the county attorney's office has a process whereby if it's an uncontested adoption, the consents have all been completed and the home study has been completed, then the county attorney's office will actually handle the adoption for the couple and save them a lot of money. So I explained that process to them.
Okay, and then so early in December 2009, they contacted you about an adoption. Do you remember the name of the woman whose baby they were going to adopt?
Yeah, I don't remember the name of the woman. The name of the child was Joshua David, I believe. Or that's the name that they were going to give the child. I don't think that child had been born yet.
Okay, and do you remember what the circumstances were going to be surrounding that adoption?
My understanding was both parents were on board as far as giving the child up for adoption. I believe that there had been a diagnosis that the child potentially had Down syndrome, and the parents decided they did not want to keep the child. I'm not sure exactly how they got in contact with the Smiths, but my understanding was they were willing to allow the Smiths to adopt their child when it was born.
Okay, so at this point, the baby had not been born yet.
That's my recollection.
Okay, and to your understanding, was this going to be a contested or uncontested adoption?
My understanding, it was going to be uncontested.
Do you remember what steps Tammi and Jack took in the process of adopting this baby?
I know they had talked to the birth parents and had secured their understanding that This would be an uncontested adoption. They asked me to prepare just the basic paperwork for an uncontested adoption, which would be a consent to adopt for both the mother and the father. And I prepared a temporary guardianship paper for that particular adoption as well.
Okay, and that leads me into my next question. What was your role in all of this, in this particular adoption?
My only role was to prepare the paperwork, just to make sure that the paperwork that was necessary for the county attorney's office to complete the adoption was all prepared properly and then completed, and then everything would be handed off to the county attorney's office at some point down the road.
Okay, and you mentioned that you prepared a temporary guardianship document.
That's correct.
What is that for, please?
Well, there's a potential gap in time between when the child is, custody of the child is delivered to the prospective adoptive parents and when they actually get in to see the court. And if they're not certified, they have to do that within 5 days. What the temporary guardianship does is just give the couple the right to take whatever action is necessary for the well-being of the child if it needs medical care, or just make sure that they have the authority to act in the best interests of the child until they get into court.
Now, do the parents of the child have the ability to revoke or cancel that temporary guardianship at any time?
They do.
And you prepared that form for Mrs. Smith. Did you email that to her?
I did.
And had you filled it out for her?
I believe I did. I could be wrong. I believe I did.
Okay. All right. Was it a Word document, though, that she could have modified if necessary?
Probably, yes.
Now, is it legally necessary for everyone involved in an adoption to have an attorney?
It's not legally necessary for anyone to have an attorney for anything, but it's advisable.
Okay. So the answer is no.
Correct.
Okay. All right. And did this young woman who was pregnant and her boyfriend, did they have an attorney representing them?
My understanding when I was first contacted by the Smiths was that they did not have counsel representing them.
Okay. At some point, did they get an attorney?
Yes, I advised Jack and Tammy that they should tell them to get someone to represent them.
Okay. And they ultimately did?
They did. I was contacted by an attorney who said she was representing them.
Okay. Do you remember that attorney's name?
It was Carrie Moore.
And so you communicated to this other couple through their attorney, correct?
That's correct. I never had direct contact with them.
Okay. Did this particular adoption go through, Ken?
No, it did not.
Do you remember what happened?
I was contacted by their attorney, and up to that point, there had not been any discussions, to my knowledge, between the Smiths and this couple regarding financial arrangements for the adoption. When I received a call from Carrie Moore, she informed me that they would be expecting some compensation for the adoption and told me in general figures what that would be. And when I relayed that to the Smiths, they were unable to meet those demands. We made a counter proposal, and that was rejected. And at that point, the adoption fell through.
Okay. Is there a legal limit on the amount of money that can be exchanged with birth parents?
Well, there's a presumptive limit of $1,000 for medical expenses and living expenses of the mother prior to the birth of the child. That can be increased by application to the court, and for good cause, the court can go beyond that $1,000 limit.
Okay. And you used a great legal phrase, presumptive limit, and the lawyers in the room know what you're talking about, but the jury might not. So when you say the presumptive limit is $1,000, can you explain that in layperson's terms?
What that means is that in the process of the adoption, if the birth couple asks for $1,000, no one will question that. The statute provides that $1,000 can be paid without question to the birth parents.
Okay, and you indicated that the Smiths made a counteroffer to this couple,
That's correct.
and that was rejected.
That's correct. They offered the $1,000, and then they offered an additional $300 for attorney's fees.
Okay, and the other couple wanted more money.
That's correct.
Did the Smiths pay you for your services for that adoption?
They did.
Now, shortly after this, they contacted you about Gabriel Johnson, correct?
That's correct.
And do you remember approximately when that first discussion took place?
It was right about the same time, within a matter of a day or two.
Do you remember who called you?
I believe it was Tammy.
And what was your understanding of the situation at that point?
My understanding was she met another couple, or mother anyway, and that they wanted to give the child up for adoption. My understanding was it was going to be an uncontested adoption.
Did you prepare any documents for this particular situation?
I believe I prepared the same documents I had prepared for the first one, that being a consent and the temporary guardianship.
Okay, and you've already explained to us what the temporary guardianship means. And again, could the parents of a child revoke or cancel that temporary guardianship at any time if they so chose?
Yes.
Now, at some point, you became aware that there were going to be problems in this situation, correct?
That's correct.
And do you remember what those problems were?
Yeah, my understanding is that at some point the father had decided not to proceed with the adoption.
Okay, and how did you become aware of this?
I believe Tammy told me.
Okay, and did you have concerns about the situation at that point?
Well, at that point I did, yeah. I wouldn't handle the adoption going forward at that point because it looked like there was going to be a problem.
Okay. Did you ever talk to Elizabeth Johnson?
I did.
Do you remember when that was?
Yeah, this all occurred within the matter of probably 3 or 4 days, all of my discussions, and they all would have been about the same time frame, shortly after the discussions regarding the first child.
Okay, and do you remember if this took place before December the 15th?
It did.
And are you sure it took place before December the 15th?
I am very sure.
And again, 2009.
Correct.
And why are you so certain it was before December the 15th, Ken?
Well, on December 15th, I went in for surgery, and so I wasn't doing anything from December 15th for probably a couple of weeks after that.
Okay, now, during your conversation with Elizabeth, did you discuss with her why she might need an attorney?
I advised her that she would need an attorney, that she should not execute any legal documents without the advice of counsel. And I believe I informed her at that point, too, that she really needed to talk to someone if there was any kind of dispute with respect to custody, because by executing the documents of consenting to adopt, if there ended up being any kind of a custody battle with the father, that would probably be used against her.
Let me ask, could counsel approach quickly, please?
You never represented Elizabeth, did you?
I did not.
And you only spoke to her the one time?
That's correct.
Now, in your discussions with Tammy about this particular baby, Gabriel Johnson, was there any discussion about the possibility of more than one father?
There was.
What do you remember about that conversation?
There was a discussion regarding whether there was any way to proceed with the adoption in the event that the father was not going to consent. And because my understanding from talking to her was that the father was actually on the birth certificate, it would be presumed that he is the father. And the only way that you could overcome that was to do DNA testing to prove that somebody else was in fact the father.
Were you aware of whether or not Gabriel Johnson's father was on the birth certificate?
I don't know at the time whether I was aware. I became aware of it later, so I couldn't say that at that point in time I was aware. Actually, I'm not even sure if I know today, but I think somewhere I came across something that said he was.
What did you tell Tammy to do regarding this situation? What advice did you give her?
Yeah, my understanding was that she had been told by Elizabeth that there was another individual who may have been the father, and that my advice was, well, go to the court and let the court know and ask the court for DNA testing so that the determination can be made as to who the father really is. And there was some reluctance, I guess, on Elizabeth's part to do that because the person was somebody that the other father, or the father, knew, and there was some concern over some discord that might come as a result of disclosing him. I told her that the only way around that would be to go to the court, explain the circumstances, ask the court to enter an order of confidentiality regarding his name until the results of the paternity testing were complete, and to file the paperwork under a fictitious name so that the court would have before it the opportunity to determine whether or not it wanted to conceal the true identity of this individual.
Now, you've told us that you had surgery on December the 15th, 2009, correct?
That's correct.
Do you remember how long you were in the hospital following your surgery?
I believe it was 3 days.
30 days?
3
days, okay.
It was 2 or 3.
Okay.
I know I kept pushing to get out, and they kept me longer than I wanted to stay, but it was 2 or 3 days.
So after your surgery, Ken, though, did you hear from Tammy?
I did. I don't remember exactly when. I heard from her at one point regarding the possibility that Logan was going to consent to the adoption. And then I heard from her after that regarding a hearing that was scheduled. I learned at that point that the mother had left the state, that there was an emergency hearing scheduled, and she was required to come back to the state. And Tammy wanted to know if there was any way that I could represent Elizabeth at that hearing.
And what did you tell Tammy?
I told her no. I did tell her that she needed to make sure she told Elizabeth to get back to that hearing, and if there was no way she could get back to that hearing, that she needed to get an attorney to represent her at that hearing, and if possible, to even call in to the hearing. And then I believe the morning of the hearing, I sent an email to Tammy giving her some names of some people that she could call that hopefully could go in and represent Elizabeth at the hearing.
Some attorneys' names?
Correct.
Did you ever discuss with Tammy adoption proceedings in any other state?
No.
Did Tammy at some point concede to you that she knew she would not be adopting Gabriel?
I told her that I advised her that unless the birth father and the birth mother both were going to consent, or they somehow determined that there was another birth father and that birth father consented, that the adoption would not go through.
Do you remember when that conversation took place?
It would have been I think it was after I got out of the hospital, because I know prior to going into the hospital, she wanted me to attend a custody hearing of some kind, which I told her I could not do. They were planning to go in for this custody hearing, like I think the day before I was going into the hospital. I just had too many things going on. There's no way I could do it. So it was sometime after that custody hearing, from what I understand, kind of determined the issues with respect to who the father was. I think at that hearing, Elizabeth actually admitted that Logan was the father, and I think that hearing was shortly after I went into the hospital.
after you talked to Tammy about the fact that she would not be able to adopt Gabriel, did she still show concern for Gabriel and Elizabeth?
She did.
In your opinion, was she obsessed with adopting Gabriel?
I don't think she thought that she was going to adopt him after that. I think that originally she wanted to adopt him. I think when it became clear that she was not going to adopt him, I think she had concern for the child and the child's well-being and wanted to do anything she could to help the child. But I don't think she was obsessed with adopting at that point. I don't think she ever was.
Now, turning our attention a little bit, are you helping the Smiths with Savannah's adoption?
I prepared the paperwork for that as well.
Okay, and do you remember how that came about, that situation?
They contacted me and told me that Jack's daughter was pregnant and did not want to keep her child and wanted to know if I could handle the paperwork for that.
And did you?
I did.
Okay, and do you remember the father of Savannah, what his situation was?
From my recollection, he was in and out of town. It was kind of difficult to locate him. I don't believe that they had a very long relationship. I think I got the impression he was kind of a drifter.
Okay, and so did he sign a consent?
I believe so.
And do you remember when that took place?
I believe it was September of 2010.
Is that adoption final?
It is not.
And do you know why not?
I believe that the home study has not been completed yet, and until the home study is completed, they can't go forward.
And to your knowledge, Ken, are there any reasons at all that Savannah's adoption might not go through?
Not that I'm aware of.
Thank you. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you. Well, we're right at the lunch hour, so we won't start a cross-examination right at the lunch hour, so we're going to take our lunch break. We'll come back at 1:30 with cross-examination. Until then, remember the admonition, and we'll see you at 1:30. Okay, please be seated. Mr. Schutt, you can step down. You don't have to stay up there. On the record, I do want to note what I told counsel when I called them up during Mr. Schutt's testimony, and that is, as I started to hear testimony regarding what Mr. Schutt told Elizabeth Johnson, it struck me that even though, from Mr. Schutt's perspective, he was not representing Elizabeth Johnson, it still could very well constitute attorney-client privileged information, and I don't have a waiver from Elizabeth Johnson, so that testimony was not appropriate. And I directed counsel not to ask any questions that would possibly elicit any other communication and told them that I would stop any testimony. But Mr. Schutt's still here, and let me tell you, to the extent that there's any questions going forward that might call for you to reveal any communication from you to Elizabeth Johnson or Elizabeth Johnson to you, you're directed not to reveal any of that information. Beyond that, I don't think there's anything else at this point that we can do. Anything else from anyone's perspective on that issue?
No, Your Honor.
No, Your Honor.
Okay. All right. Anything else we need to talk about before lunch?
Not from the statement.
No, Your Honor. When did Your Honor want to discuss jury instructions?
Here's what I expect to happen. We'll pick up with the cross-examination after lunch. We'll have Detective Rameriz likely fairly briefly, and then we'll send the jury home for the day after that. After that, we'll talk about jury instructions. I think that'll give us plenty of time. I have a 3:30 hearing, but we should have plenty of time before then. You should have the latest version. I took into account the emails that were exchanged on Friday between the parties and the court's judicial assistant on the various comments on the jury instructions. So I've incorporated some of those, and then we'll discuss where we're at. But I think we're pretty close in terms of finalizing them.
Your Honor, for the record, just to get us a step closer, Ms. Phillips sent an email adding another one about the defendant's request for an attorney. The state has no objection to that requested instruction.
We'll add that. My inclination was to add it. I just have to give it a title, basically, and then I'll include it. But my review did suggest that was an appropriate addition, and so we'll add that suggestion as well. All right, so I'll see everybody at 1:30. Ms. Andrews, you may proceed when you're ready.
Good afternoon, Mr. Schutt.
Good afternoon.
I'd like to talk first about Savannah and the adoption you did for the Smiths regarding Savannah. You indicated that that's not final yet,
That's correct.
and you indicated there has to be some sort of judgment.
Well, the matter has to be presented to the court for final approval of the adoption, and my understanding is that has not yet happened.
Okay, and you also indicated that a home study has to be done before that happens.
That's correct.
Now, you talked before a little bit about the county attorney's office and that you just fill out paperwork. Is this final process something you ever do?
I've never done one, final process. I've only done the preliminary paperwork, handed it off to the county attorney's office because it's a lot cheaper for the clients.
It's a lot cheaper than using a private attorney to do that?
Yes, it is.
And in fact, did you recommend that they go through the county attorney's office in regard to Savannah's adoption?
I did.
I want to talk to you now a little bit about Joshua David, the baby you talked about that the Smiths were going to adopt at one point. You indicated that your recommendation was for them to have private counsel.
The parents of Joshua?
The parents of Joshua,
Yes, that's correct.
And what's the reason for that recommendation?
Basically so that they understand what the nature of the rights are that they're basically giving away, that the execution of the documents that they're going to execute are irrevocable, that once they execute those documents, they are waiving their rights to their children or their child, and that they need to fully understand the ramifications of that.
And in this case, you actually made some recommendations to Tammi Smith of some other adoption lawyers. Is that correct?
I did. I'm not sure that I made recommendations of adoption lawyers for the other party. I know I gave her the names of someone to help out with the family home study. And I know at one point I gave her the names of two family law attorneys that could handle the anticipated hearing where Elizabeth was going to come back to the state.
So you provided some names of some family law attorneys to Tammi Smith?
I did.
In regard to the adoption of Joshua David, though, the parents ended up getting their own attorney,
That's correct.
and that was Carrie Moore.
That's correct.
And is that someone you were previously familiar with?
I believe I was. I think, if I remember correctly, I had a case with her years ago.
And in regard to the adoption you were doing for Tammi and Jack Smith, were you charging them discounted fees?
I was.
Were you trying to keep their costs down as low as possible?
I was.
Now, we actually spoke on the telephone on May 8th, 2012, correct?
That's correct.
And do you recall at that time talking to us a little bit about Carrie Moore and how she might charge fees?
Yes.
And what specifically did you tell us about the fees that Carrie Moore might charge?
Well, it depends on what kind of situation you're talking about. In this particular case, for some reason, my recollection is that her anticipated fees were going to be around $2,500 to review the paperwork and make sure that everything was in order. If you're talking about a situation where an attorney is involved in a private placement, and that is where they have actually located a child, put the child together with the prospective parents, then they're going to charge a lot more. But that's not what we were dealing with here.
So in this particular case, it's your opinion that Carrie Moore's fees were actually less than if she had gone out and sought out the families?
Yes.
And do you recall specifically, you indicated an amount somewhere around $2,500. Do you recall, in addition to the attorney's fees, how much it was that Carrie Moore was asking for expenses in that particular adoption?
My recollection is that that was an additional $2,500. It was the $1,000 for the presumptive limit, and an additional approximately $1,500, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Now, we talked about the presumptive limit, and you described that statutorily the law allows to pay up to $1,000 without having to ask for any additional permission. Does the law preclude asking for more than $1,000?
No, it does not.
Does it preclude obtaining more than $1,000?
No, it does not.
And what has to happen in order to be able to receive those additional monies for the expenses?
Through the process, you would apply for the additional monies to the court. The judge would review the application and determine if the additional funds were reasonable, and if he deemed them reasonable, he would award those.
Now, you indicated in this particular case, the Smiths were not able to pay the amounts that Carrie Moore was asking for her clients. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that's what the Smiths indicated to you?
Well, I don't know if it was they didn't have the money or they didn't want to pay the additional funds.
And who did you do most of the speaking with in regard to this adoption as far as the Smiths?
With Tammy.
Okay. Did you talk to Jack at all about this adoption?
I don't recall that I talked to Jack about the adoption with Joshua, no.
Now, you've indicated that you sent to Carrie Moore a counteroffer on behalf of the Smiths.
That's correct.
And you indicated that you received a response that the adoption was not going through.
That's correct.
Did you specifically receive a response that counteroffer itself was rejected?
What I received was a response from Carrie Moore saying that she had heard from her clients, that they had talked to or texted, I believe, with the Smiths, and I don't remember if it was Jack or Tammy, and that based upon her instructions from her client that they were not going to proceed.
So she didn't specifically say that they were not proceeding because they rejected the counteroffer?
Not that I recall.
And you testified about providing Tammi Smith with a temporary guardianship document?
Correct.
Your Honor, may I approach?
You may.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as exhibit number 235. Do you recognize that exhibit?
Yes.
And what is that exhibit?
This is an email that I sent to Tammi Smith regarding the temporary guardianship for Joshua David, and attached is a form of the temporary guardianship.
Your Honor, I move for the admission of exhibit number 235.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Exhibit 235 is admitted.
Your Honor, permission to publish?
You may.
I'm only going to publish the second page because the first page has email addresses and phone numbers on it. Now, I believe you were asked on direct examination, if you recall, if you filled out the temporary guardianship. Do you know if you filled it out by looking at it? Do you recall?
Well, I know that whatever's here, I prepared, and to the extent that anything else was filled out after this, I don't recall.
And in this particular document, it appears there's a date period from December 3rd, 2009 to May 3rd, 2010. What is the purpose for there to be a time period in that?
The statute allows for temporary guardianship for up to 6 months, and it looks as though Joshua was born on December 3rd, so I just went from that date 6 months forward, and that's the only significance to those dates.
Now, you indicated that this temporary guardianship was done at your recommendation because there's a waiting period before the adoption goes through?
Well, if you don't have your home study done, then you have 5 days to apply to the court for temporary custody. Basically, this is just designed to make sure during that 5-day period, if there's any emergency situations that come up with respect to the child, that you'll have the authorization to deal with those.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about Gabriel. You testified that it was your understanding when you first talked to Tammi Smith that the father in this case was not objecting to the adoption. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And at some point later, you found out that he, in fact, was.
That's correct.
So at the time you first talked to the defendant, Tammi Smith, about Gabriel, you believe this was an uncontested adoption.
That's correct.
And had you known it was a contested adoption, you would not have proceeded further because you don't do those.
That's correct.
Now, you've testified that Elizabeth was afraid to put the name of the father on the paperwork. Did you talk to Tammi Smith about that?
Yes.
And was it Tammi Smith who told you that?
Yes.
When Tammi Smith told you that Elizabeth was afraid to put the name of the father, that's because, according to Tammi Smith, that person is somebody the other father knew.
That's correct.
And in fact, you told Tammi specifically that she needed to put a false name such as a John Doe on the document.
I did tell her to go to the court, let the court know that there was this potential third party, and that she should use a fictitious name. I probably used the term John Doe, but I did use the phrase fictitious name.
And in fact, when you talked to us in the interview on May 8th, 2012, you used the words John Doe when you talked to us.
I think I used both.
Okay. And so you talked to the defendant about putting a fictitious name on the document. Did you tell her to find a real person who'd never met Elizabeth Johnson to put their name down on the document?
No, I didn't discuss that possibility. I didn't think that that was something that would likely happen, but in reality, I guess the issue is to make sure that you're putting before the court the possibility that there is a third party. What name you use doesn't really matter because ultimately the court has to decide who the father is. So whether you use John Doe or any other name, what you're doing is presenting to the court that there's a third party that may be a father here. And it's not going to be a function of that particular pleading having any final determinative factor. The court's ultimately going to have to decide who the father is.
So it was not your intention for them to put down the name of somebody else who would have a DNA test even though they couldn't be the father?
Well, the intention was whoever that third party was, the other potential father, the DNA test would be of that person and the purported father.
And in fact, wasn't the reason for that because if there was to be an adoption of Gabriel, whoever was his real father would have had to have obtained notice that there was adoption proceedings?
That's correct.
And so if there was another potential father out there, and his name was not ever provided to the court for DNA testing, an adoption could never go through because he couldn't get notice. That's a bad question. Let me ask it a little differently. In fact, it was your intention for them to advise the court of another potential father in case he was the father so that he could get notice.
Correct.
And when we talk about notice, what is required as far as notice? I mean, does that require you send some notice to that person where they're living or wherever they get their mail?
Yes.
Is there a proceeding available in case you can't locate that person?
There is the ability, if you have made significant efforts to find that person and you're unable to do so, there's a provision for publication of the notice.
Now, in order to do the publication of notice, do you have to first demonstrate you were unable to find that person?
You do.
And so other than, in addition to not telling them, or in addition to telling them to put a different name, a fictitious name on the document, did you tell them to put the name of Tammi Smith's cousin on the document?
I didn't tell them to put any particular name in there.
Did you tell them to put the name of one of Tammi Smith's friend's husbands on that document?
I didn't tell them to put any particular name.
Now, you testified that Tammi Smith asked you to represent Elizabeth Johnson in the family court matter, but you declined that because you don't handle those.
That's correct.
And in fact, you provided her names of people who could handle those hearings.
I did.
Did you tell Tammi Smith to tell Elizabeth she did not need to show for court?
I did not. Well, let me rephrase that. What I told her was that she needed to be at court, that the judge was probably pretty upset, and that the best thing for her was to get into court and explain why she did whatever she did. that if she was unable to get to court, she needed to at least have an attorney to represent her so that the attorney could hopefully explain to the judge what the circumstances were. And I think I also may have advised her that if it was possible for her to at least call in during the time of the hearing, that would be a good idea as well.
Now, I believe you also testified that you had no conversations with Tammi Smith about adoptions proceeding in another state.
That's correct.
Let me ask you this. I know we talked about a check you received on December 8th, 2009 for adoption proceedings. Do you know which adoption that was for?
That would have been for the original Joshua David adoption, but since that didn't go through, the funds were applied to what I did on the other case as well.
So, but on December 8th, 2009, you received a check from Tammi Smith for $250 for the adoption of Joshua David.
That's correct.
Now, you testified on direct examination that you didn't think that Tammi Smith was going to adopt Gabriel after Elizabeth Johnson left the state. Is that correct?
I think I came to the conclusion when I determined that, and this was after the custody hearing that was held, I think, when I was in the hospital. When I got out of the hospital, I went online, got a copy of the court's notes as to what happened at that hearing. And at that hearing, rather than pursue the fictitious father angle, I guess Elizabeth just admitted that Logan was in fact the father. At that point, I realized that there was no way at all that they were going to go forward with the adoption unless Logan were to go ahead and consent.
And you actually told Tammi Smith that.
That's true.
And then are you aware that after Elizabeth Johnson left the state with Gabriel, the defendant and her husband were going through foster classes in order to adopt Gabriel?
I don't know what they were doing in connection with that.
You were referred to the defendant by your church.
Correct.
Was that in December of 2009?
That's correct.
Did you know either of the Smiths prior to that date?
I did not.
So are you aware at all about Tammi Smith's attempts to find a surrogate?
No.
Are you aware of the circumstances in which the defendant met Joshua David's mother?
Not as I sit here today. She may have told me back then, but I don't recall.
And as you sit here today, are you aware of the circumstances in which the defendant met Elizabeth Johnson?
No.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Redirect, Ms. Phillips.
I have nothing, Your Honor.
Okay, before we let Mr. Schutt step down, let me see if the jury's got any questions for you before you go anywhere. Does the jury have any questions for Mr. Schutt? Doesn't look like it. May this witness be excused, Ms. Phillips?
Yes, Your Honor.
Ms. Andrews?
Yes, sure.
Now you can step down. Thank you. Does the defense have any other witnesses?
Your Honor, the defense does.
Okay, so the defense is now rested, and that means that should the state choose that the state may present rebuttal evidence, does the state have any rebuttal evidence?
We do, Your Honor. Briefly, we recall Detective Ramirez.
Okay, Detective Ramirez, coming back up. We're not going to swear you in again. You're still under oath, of course. Ms. Andrews, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Detective, you heard a lot of testimony from the defendant about the search warrant in this case, correct?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit more than what you told us at direct examination about what occurred during that search warrant?
I'm going to object. I think that goes beyond the defense case. I don't think it's proper rebuttal. I don't remember us going into that.
Actually, I remember Ms. Smith talking about things that happened during the execution of the search warrant. Depending on how far we go, I think it's a fair response to what was at least presented via testimony. If it goes beyond that, we can certainly take it back up. So this is without prejudice to raise it again. But I think the topic was discussed in the defense case, so you may answer the question.
Thank you.
And Detective, let me be a little more specific. Can you tell us a little bit about what officers were present?
Initially, as I was preparing the search warrant, we had Tempe police officers that work undercover at the residence. They were there roughly from about 9 p.m. until we arrived, detectives, another sergeant, and I recall arriving approximately about 10:30 to 11 p.m. that night. When I first arrived, I noticed 2 helicopters in the distance.
Detective, hold on a minute. We'll get there. I'm asking about the officers who were present. You indicated there were undercover officers present. During the search warrant itself, were they undercover?
Yes, there were certain officers that were dressed in Tempe police. They didn't have like a mask over their face or anything like that, but they're more of our surveillance officers.
Were they wearing vests that indicated they were police officers?
Yes.
And were they armed?
Yes.
And in addition to those officers who were present, what other officers were present during the search warrant?
Then you also had detectives. There were approximately 6 of us as detectives, and Sergeant Brudnock, my immediate sergeant, was present.
Was there another supervisor present as well?
Yes, for the initial officers that were there, there was Sergeant Johnson was present, and he remained present when I arrived.
Was the SWAT team present?
No, we didn't have a SWAT team there at the residence, no.
Now, these officers who were present for this search warrant, is that unusual procedure for a search warrant?
No.
And I believe we've heard testimony about the size of the property in this case. Tell us a little bit about the size of the Smiths' property at this time.
The home was very large, approximately about 5,000 square feet.
And we've heard some testimony about the actions taken by the officers as far as tearing apart the Smiths' home. Did that happen?
No.
And we've heard some testimony about taking of the computers. Did the police take the defendant's computer?
No.
And when I ask about the computer, let's talk about the desktop. Was the desktop taken?
No.
What exactly was taken in regard to the computer?
Due to their business, we actually made a copy so that we could leave their computer available for their business, as well as a copy of the cell phones. So we transferred information, and that's what we actually took.
So was the defendant's BlackBerry cell phone taken?
No.
And was Jack's cell phone taken?
No.
How long were you at the home for the search warrant?
I recall leaving at approximately 1 in the morning.
And how long did your supervisor put in for overtime for the time that you were there at the search warrant?
Approximately 2 p.m., he put in a slip, and that's travel time back to the station and then wrapping up to leave.
Was that 2 p.m. or 2 a.m.?
I'm sorry, 2 a.m.
That includes travel time back to the station?
Yes.
Now, you've heard testimony from the defendant that there were helicopters present during the search warrant. Does Tempe Police Department even have a helicopter?
No, we do not.
Did you borrow a helicopter from some other agency for this search warrant?
No, we did not.
What were the helicopters that were present?
My belief is that it was media present.
Did the Tempe Police Department alert the media that there would be a search warrant that night?
No.
Let's talk about the media since we brought it up. You heard testimony from the defendant that that she and her husband had several media appearances on this case in order to help find Gabriel. She also testified that that's because nobody else would talk to the media. Do you recall that testimony?
Yes.
We talked a little bit on your direct examination about your public information officer. Did your public information officer have contact with the media during this case?
Yes.
In releasing information to the media in a case like this, who makes those decisions as far as the police department?
Our command staff, our chief of police, the public information officer, makes all of those decisions together.
And when you make those decisions, or the command staff makes those decisions, are there considerations made about what information should be released to the public and what should not?
Absolutely. You want to make sure that you don't compromise the investigation, so we often will limit information that is released.
Now, we've heard testimony about some things the police department was doing to try and locate Elizabeth Johnson, including ordering phone records, text messages, a wiretap at some point in this case. Is information that's out in the public, does that affect the police's ability to investigate a case?
Yes.
And how so?
A good example for that would be our tips. So we limit some information out there because, again, we don't want to compromise an investigation. So when we receive tips, and in this investigation we had many, we can also clean through those and see what information is valid. If someone isn't aware of certain things that is coming through on a tip, then that's something for us to look further into. Yet, if the public knew everything, in many ways, then we wouldn't even be able to validate a tip and see if there's some truthfulness to it.
Now, was the police department in contact with Logan in regard to what would be released to the public and what wouldn't be released?
Yes.
And did that also include Logan's family?
Yes.
Now, Detective Rameriz, were you present over the 3 different days that the defendant testified?
Yes.
And during her testimony, did you hear anything you'd never heard before?
Yes.
Now, remind us, how many times approximately did you talk to the defendant about this case?
Well, I had 4 formal interviews, and then I spoke to her often on the telephone. I spoke to her from the very first day, from December 27th of 09, and I interviewed her on December 29th of 09, December 31st of 09, in person on January 15th of 2010, and that was twice in the same day, and also February 2nd of 2010.
So the defendant testified previously that she said she never thought she was at the courthouse on December 14, 2009 when she filled out the paperwork. Did she ever tell you that?
When I interviewed her January 14th of 2010, she informed me that she was at the courthouse. And I also had her explain what she did at the courthouse. So the word courthouse was used during our interview on the 14th.
And let me ask you, Detective, are you familiar with where the law library is in the downtown Phoenix court building?
Yes.
Have you seen it?
Yes.
And what does it say on the law library?
On the very top before you enter, it says Superior Court Law Library.
And where is that located?
It's in the east building of Superior Court in Phoenix.
Is there a way to get into that building without going through security?
No.
The defendant also testified that her attorney told her to use a John Doe. Do you recall her ever using the words John Doe in any of your interviews?
No.
There was some testimony from the defendant talking about drinking wine and using Craig's name. Do you recall that testimony?
Yes.
How did that testimony differ from what the defendant told you?
When I interviewed her January 14th of 2010, she discussed the night before that she had some wine and that her cousin's name had come up and so forth. So during that interview, everything was the night before. Currently, on the stand, what I heard her say was it was a few days prior, and she had much more detail as to what occurred days prior to the actual day of going to court.
Now, also in this trial, the defendant testified about Elizabeth Johnson's printer being broken, and therefore the defendant had to type up that document on December 18th, 2009. And that document we're referring to is the one where it said that Logan could only have so many bottles and so many diapers. Do you recall that?
Yes.
When the defendant testified about Elizabeth Johnson's printer being broken, is that what she told you?
No.
What did she tell you?
When she called me, and I believe I have the date correct, January 22nd of 2010, she called to inform me that she couldn't find a certain document in her computer, that it would be available for us. She gave the description and so forth. And near the end of that conversation, she stated that she wasn't sure why Elizabeth had her type up that document, because Elizabeth, in fact, had owned her own computer. She never mentioned anything about a printer, and the printer wasn't working, and that's why she had to type up that document.
Now, in regard to the search warrant, again, the defendant testified that the police were there until 3 a.m. Was that inconsistent with what really happened?
Yes.
And what time, again, did you leave?
Approximately 1 o'clock in the morning.
And again, in regard to the search warrant, the defendant also denied asking you to sit on the floor with her when she did the interview. Tell us what occurred in relation to the defendant asking you to sit on the floor.
We went into a west bedroom, and she did state that she was going to sit on the floor, and if I could sit on the floor along with her. And just for officer safety, I wouldn't put myself in that position, so I informed her that no, I wouldn't be sitting on the carpet on the floor with her. She then looked for an item, and I sat on something, and she then sat on the floor.
And who else was present in that room when you were talking to the defendant during the search warrant?
It was just the two of us. Initially, Detective Duplessis had entered to take photographs of the residence, but the door was left open. I could hear other officers, detectives working, so the door was wide open with us.
And you testified previously on direct examination that you recorded that interview.
Yes.
And in fact, we admitted that but did not play it here in the courtroom.
Correct.
But it's available for the jury to listen to?
Yes.
The defendant testified that when she met Elizabeth Johnson at the airport, that she had been with her grandmother in Boston and that her grandmother and Elizabeth were trying to have Gabriel adopted. Is that what she told you?
I'd never heard that before, no.
And the defendant also testified that Elizabeth happily signed the guardianship document on December 9th, 2009, and that Elizabeth also asked if they had adoption papers for her to sign. Had you ever heard that before?
No.
The defendant also testified that on December 18th, 2009, that Elizabeth told the defendant that she was going to change her hair color and pack up, and Logan would never see Gabriel again. Had you ever heard that before?
No.
The defendant also testified that Elizabeth was back and forth on whether or not to give Gabriel up for adoption during the 9 days the defendant had Gabriel. Had you ever heard that before?
No.
And she also testified that the night before they met with a CPS worker, Elizabeth called her and said she changed her mind about the adoption. Have you ever heard that before?
No.
The defendant also testified that Elizabeth showed the defendant harassing phone calls from Logan. Had you ever heard that before?
No, I hadn't.
Do you know what harassing phone calls she's talking about?
No.
Have you heard the recordings of the phone calls between Elizabeth Johnson and Logan McQueary?
Yes.
Would you classify them as harassing on the part of Logan?
No.
The defendant also testified that Logan told the defendant that he and his dad were going to ping Elizabeth Johnson's phone and that his dad was a police officer. Have you ever heard that before?
No.
In fact, the Tempe Police Department was pinging the phone, though.
Correct.
Have we talked about every inconsistency you heard when the defendant testified at trial?
No.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Cross-examination, Ms. Phillips.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Detective Rameriz.
Good afternoon.
You've indicated to us both earlier when you testified last week or the week before, as well as today, that you talked to Ms. Smith many, many times, correct?
Correct.
Sometimes in person at her home, correct?
Correct.
And many times on the telephone.
Yes.
Correct. And it was your testimony when you testified originally that you recorded many, even most, but not all of those conversations, correct?
Correct.
At any time, did she ever refuse to talk to you?
No.
It's not unlawful for a person to give an interview to the media, is it?
No.
Did you ever tell Ms. Smith to not talk to the media?
No.
Thank you. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you. Any redirect?
One question, Your Honor. Detective Ramirez, you indicated that you recorded many but not all of the phone calls with Tammi Smith.
Correct.
How many do you recall not recording?
Just one or two.
And is that the one you talked about where you were at home and didn't have your recorder?
Correct.
No further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Does the jury have any questions for Detective Ramirez before she steps down this time? Going once, going twice. May this witness be excused?
Yes,
Ms.
Your Honor.
Andrews, Ms. Phillips?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may step down. Thank you. Does the state have any additional witnesses?
We do not, Your Honor.
Does the state rest its rebuttal case?
We do.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that means that the evidence is now complete. And that means the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to get into closing arguments. However, what I have to do before that is read you the final jury instructions. Typically, in a longer trial, what I will frequently do is if we finish in the afternoon, I'll take the next time to discuss the jury instructions with counsel, make sure they're finalized. And I always worry about closing arguments that go toward the end of the day because we don't want to run out of time as well. So usually in this position, what I'll do is I'll wait till the next day to start closing arguments, and that's what we're going to do in this case. So we finished all the evidence. What's going to happen tomorrow is when you come back at 10:30, I'm going to give you the final jury instructions, read them to you like I did with the preliminary instructions, and then we'll have closing arguments, and then the case will be submitted to you tomorrow afternoon for your consideration. So we're finished early today. You get most of the afternoon off. Make sure you're here ready to go at 10:30 tomorrow. Until then, remember the admonition, and we'll see you tomorrow morning at 10:30.